All right, welcome back, Social 30. Today we're looking at lesson 4, which is the official end of related issue 1. Good news, there's 4 related issues in the year. Does that mean we're a quarter of the way done the year? No. Related issue 1 of the 60 multiple choice, there may be 4, there may be 6 multiple choice from this related issue. So maybe we're done a tenth of the year after today. As I mentioned, related issue 1, pages 71 to 85, comes up on every A1. So that is the key part of related issue 1, is basically the values of, or the characteristics of individualism and the characteristics of collectivism. Because when we get to a source, we're asking you, is it reflecting or rejecting individualism or collectivism? And in order to do that, we need to be able to look at the characteristics of individualism and collectivism. So within individualism, is it a commentary about private property? Is it a commentary about competition? Is it a commentary about individual rights and freedoms? Is it a commentary about self-interest? We need to be more specific. If we just say it's reflecting individualism, instead of saying it's reflecting the individualist characteristic of self-interest, if we're just saying it reflects individualism, that's an S. That's straightforward, that's generalized. If we can go into the characteristics from pages 71 to 85 and say it's reflecting self-interest, and this is how it reflects it, now we're at a PF. So how do you go from a 60 to an 80? You need to be more specific. So from pages 71 to 85, there's some key content for that for your A1. Also with related issue 1 so far, we introduced ourselves to some term projects. Key terms, we have to keep a glossary of key terms. When words and phrases come up like malaise and modernity that we attach to Rousseau, maybe you write that stuff down into a glossary of key terms. There's a cast of characters. You know, who are the people we're coming across? And we're coming across a lot of people. So when I say lottery of birth is an idea from Peter Singer, that's like, oh man, I might want to quote that. Singer says lottery of birth. And it talks about how absolutism and feudalism was flawed because it didn't reflect meritocracy. We're also looking at term projects that evaluate the role of government and the role of citizen under individualism and collectivism. And then we have that big one with the essay. So related issue 1 allowed us to introduce the course, but that's all that it is an introduction. Today we finish it by looking at some application of the theory we've been studying. So we're going to go back to Social 20 and see how things connect to the French Revolution. And again, how many people only had 5 weeks of 20 last year until we went to... Okay, yeah. That's really too bad because like 20, when you get the full 20, we preload so much for 30. So don't be concerned if you didn't get the full 20 because I'm here to make good that lag, right? But yeah, so we're going to talk about the French Revolution. We're also going to talk about hypothetical studies. In the textbook, it talks about 1984 and it talks about Brave New World. So we're gonna see how some of this dystopian literature can unlock ideologies. So we'll look at that today. And we'll also talk about contemporary issues like healthcare and taxation and the growth of surveillance society, this big state that we live under, the big brother that is watching us. So that's our objectives here today. We may get this done and still have some time before lunchtime. And if that's the case, I might give you some time to study for tomorrow's evaluation. Keep in mind, it's not a midterm, it's not heavily weighted, it's just designed so that you're not going to go away from me for 2 weekends not knowing how well you're doing. Right? Yeah, I know that these are short weeks, but I still need you to know how well you're doing. So that's why we're doing that. So first things first, we have the French Revolution. How does the French Revolution connect to this course? Well, yesterday we looked at the political spectrum, and as you may know, the modern political spectrum, words like radical and reactionary, they come from the French Revolution. So during the French Revolution, if you were a reactionary, you wanted to go back to the age of feudalism. You wanted to restore the absolute monarchy, and you're willing to use violence. So counter-revolutionaries during the revolution that were seeking to use violence to restore the old regime, they're reactionaries. That's where the idea of reactionary really comes from in the modern political spectrum. So when they would gather together in places like the National Assembly or the National Convention, because they kept changing the name of their parliament, when they would gather together in their parliament, the reactionaries, they're not going to sit with just anybody. They're going to sit with people that have the same ideology as them. So guess where they sat? Don't overthink it. Guess where they sat? So if there's a room, and there's like a middle of the room, there's a left, and there's a right, where do you think the reactionaries sat? Far right. Right? So reactionaries are far right, and that's where they sat. So where do we get the political spectrum from? The left and the right, the radicals and reactionaries? We get those ideas from where they sat in the National Assembly. The radicals, people like Robespierre, Danton, and Desmoulins, and Saint-Just, and Hébert, they sat on the left, the extreme left. And the further to the left they went, up the mountain, they were even more radical. Let's kill the king. We need a republic. Whereas the further to the right they were sitting, the more violent they were at wanting to save the king or restore the king. So the modern ideas of radical and reactionary, they come from where people sat in the French Revolution. To the far left, you had radicals. To the far right, you had reactionaries. The moderates sat in the middle.
Please excuse the interruption. At this time, the textbook room will be open for 1 hour. If there is any
1 hour. Limited time only. Come down, get your textbooks.
Thank you.
So, slightly to the left of center, you would have had liberals, people that are progressive like the radicals, but maybe not so extreme. Slightly to the right of center, you'd have conservatives, people that like the status quo, might be willing to do a little bit of change, but don't want to see anything too dramatic, and definitely are not violent. So where did we get where they sit? From the French Revolution. French Revolution is also key because during the French Revolution, we really get to begin to evaluate different political systems. At the beginning of the French Revolution, we can evaluate a monarchy, an absolute monarchy. And we can talk about how it was a flawed society and how it needed to evolve. So why did they have to have a French Revolution? Well, they had to have a French Revolution because the government was inefficient. So its inefficiency under King Louis XVI was exposed through the taxation system. Remember, King Louis and his kingdom, they were bankrupt. They were bankrupt because they couldn't efficiently collect taxes. And one of the reasons they couldn't efficiently collect taxes is because there's corruption among the nobles and officers of King Louis that were collecting the taxes. There's also a bread shortage. So they needed something. They needed more individualism. They needed more capitalism. They needed more opportunity in a free market to sell bread. Or they needed maybe more security, you could argue. Maybe they needed to regulate the price of bread so that everybody could afford it. We also had a great gulf, great disparity between the rich and the poor, the haves and have-nots. And this created generations of despair. Generations of despair that was so condemning that people were willing to use violence to change their destiny. That's why we need maybe meritocracy. To some extent, that's why you need capitalism, because there should be an equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity didn't exist in the old regime. You're born into the second estate, you're a noble, you're going to have opportunities that the third estate do not have. So we have a number of reasons or causes of the French Revolution, but also during the French Revolution you can say, well, this is what they achieved when they were a republic. But then, as you may recall, what did they end up doing? They turned back towards an authoritarian leader. So they needed Napoleon to save the revolution. So although that poster back there is definitely wrong, because it's showing Napoleon on a horse and underneath it says the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Declaration of the Rights of Man are accomplished in 1789, a decade before Napoleon rises to power. But one could argue that had Napoleon not came and saved the revolution from counter-revolutionaries, some of the accomplishments of the Declaration would have been taken away. So the French Revolution also gives us an opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness or the need for authoritarianism. That Napoleon was welcomed by the French because they needed his stability. After 10 years of revolution, after seeing counter-revolutions and chaos in the streets, tens of thousands of people executed at the guillotine, they're more than happy to see themselves surrender their power to the Leviathan that is Napoleon. In a Hobsonian way, Napoleon is the embodiment of, you know what? Surrender some of your natural freedom to me, and I will restore security. And ultimately make France great again. I can see him wearing a little hat. So the French Revolution tells us about the spectrum, but it also gives us some case study to look at, under what circumstances might people say, you know what, authoritarianism does work. So when we look at Adolf Hitler in Social 20, or when we relook at him this year, because you didn't get to see him last year in 20, we see how the German people elect the Nazis into power. That they needed a centralization of authority. That to some people, Hitler was the solution to the problems that Germany had, much like Napoleon was the solution. So the French Revolution helps us because it gives us some case studies to show the effectiveness of authoritarianism, but the ineffectiveness of the monarchy. So within our notes here, I have a quick little summary of the French Revolution. So in the summary, we talk about some of the philosophers we've already seen, like Hobbes and Locke, and what they might have thought about the revolution. We talk about the different phases of the revolution. You're not going to be tested on the revolution in multiple choice. So that's not why you would study this. You might look it over because in an essay, you might want to present how the revolution shows us the need to sometimes have a authoritarian leader. That's probably the main reason or the main way people use the French Revolution in this course, is to lump Napoleon's accomplishments with Hitler's accomplishments, with Stalin's accomplishments, throw in the philosophy of Hobbes into that same paragraph, and show that authoritarianism at times does accomplish greatness. That's how we use the French Revolution. We use it to some extent to further understand the spectrum, but I think you get that now and you'd never have to restudy that. But the only way that you need to go back to the revolution now is to establish, the need for authoritarianism, or the responsibility of citizens to voice their discontent against a state that is not legitimate. So when we get to citizenship towards the end of the year, both in the calendar, because we'll study it in December, and because it's one of our last topics, we'll look at how citizens in 1789 France said, we're no longer subjects of the king, we want to be citizens. And with citizenship came a responsibility to question the legitimacy and the authority of the state. So that when Robespierre began to behave like a madman, let's have a republic of virtue, let's go to war with the waves, let's send my soldiers into the ocean to fight against the waves because we're fighting against Neptune, the god. The people began to look at that and said, this is not our will, and they executed Robespierre. So you can also use the French Revolution to show the proper role of a citizen, as citizens have the responsibility to hold their government accountable. They held Robespierre accountable by executing him. They held King Louis XVI accountable by executing him. Should we execute Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? Well, I'll let you decide that. But we also hold Justin Trudeau accountable at election time. So the term accountability and legitimacy also is illustrated through this case study. I love the French Revolution. So in Social 20, rather than the 3 pages in the textbook, we spend a week or so on it. But we're not going to spend a week or so on it now. We're going to be moving on to hypothetical studies. Any questions about the French Revolution? All right then. Next up in the world of hypothetical studies, the textbook introduces us to Brave New World and to 1984. And we often see Brave New World in essays, but more often we see 1984. And because of the post 9/11 Orwellian-esque world that we live in, 1984 is very relevant to A1s and is mentioned in essays. So I want to make sure we explore what those mean. Now, you can go ahead and read 1984. I have copies that I could lend you. You can watch the TV show Brave New World. Probably not going to watch it in here because it's kind of like Game of Thrones. There's a lot of sexuality in it. But at the same time, I'm going to give you literally the Coles Notes versions today. I'm going to give you enough of the plot and the themes here so that you can use them as case studies. You can use them as hypothetical case studies. So an e-paper, like the Zach Ripka's that I showed you, an e-paper is not going to just give you historical evidence. Here's Hitler, and here's Stalin. And that's all I got. So an e-paper, a comprehensive paper, sees things in terms of many levels. Here's some historical evidence, but here's some contemporary application as well. So this is how it still affects the world in 2020. That looks good. Then you're going to add some theory. Here's some Hobbes and Locke and those guys. So now you have history, you have contemporary, you have theory, but we also have hypothetical case studies. And 1984 and Brave New World are 2 of the key ones that we can use to really show the dystopian nature of authoritarian states. So, let's jump in. Any questions yet? So, for example, on the diploma exam, and I think I'm going to dim the one set of lights so you guys can see the board better. On the diploma exam in, I want to say 2010, they had in the A1 a source that wasn't this one, but was inspired by this one. So the item developers at Alberta Ed, they were aware of this ad from the London Metro, and they thought, you know what, we can probably make a source that is based on this. The idea that the government is creating this advertisement, you could say propaganda, that says that they are making us secure by watching us, but the idea that they're watching us actually, by looking at this, it makes us feel threatened by the government itself. So there's this irony, there's this hypocrisy, there's this twist, right? And they saw this and they decided, you know what, we're going to make a A1 source similar to this. And it's one of those A1 sources that really, to some extent, summarizes this course. Similar to the cartoon I showed you yesterday with the eyes watching the guy, right? So where does this concept come from? When people might say it's very Orwellian, we're about to explore that. One of the things we're talking about when we talk about Orwell is this is meant to be a dystopia. So on the surface, it looks like an ideal London. You know, it's ideal because we're safe. And we're safe because Big Brother's watching us. But there's something not so ideal about it. A dystopia is a flawed society. And in Orwell's 1984, what makes it a dystopia is the relationship between government and citizen. And that's our course, right? Relationship between government and citizen. And what is the tool of the perversion of that relationship? It's technology. It's this surveillance state that, you know, George Orwell was writing about more than a half century ago, but now that we live in today in 2020. We live in the the type of dystopian future that he feared. So he called the book 1984 because he was future casting. That he writes it decades before 1984, and he calls it 1984 because it was meant to be a warning. He purposely sets the story in London because he wants to show people living in a liberal democracy like England how they could become more like the non-liberal states like Stalin's USSR or Hitler's Germany that they feared. And he showed them how the government could even manipulate it and make them believe that they want this relationship. So that's the message in 1984, is that a liberal democracy can be lost. And really, the word that fits here that he wasn't using is illiberalism. It's illiberal because there's this facade of liberalism. They pretend to be liberal, but they're not. They're acting like an authoritarian state. So, we're going to look at a quick summary of what it means to be Orwellian. And during it, we're going to watch it, but I'm going to, as best as I can, I'm going to pause me talking so we can just hear the TED Talk. So what does it mean to be Orwellian? Let's check it out.
If you've watched the news or followed politics, chances are you've heard the term Orwellian thrown around in one context or another. But have you ever stopped to think about what it really means or why it's used so often? The term was named after British author Eric Blair, known by his pen name George Orwell. Because his most famous work, the novel 1984, depicts an oppressive society under a totalitarian government, Orwellian is often used simply to mean authoritarian. But using the term in this way not only fails to fully convey Orwell's message, it actually risks doing precisely what he tried to warn against. Orwell was indeed opposed to all forms of tyranny, spending much of his life fighting against anti-democratic forces of both the left wing and the right. But he was also deeply concerned with how such ideologies proliferate. And one of his most profound insights was the importance that language plays in shaping our thoughts and opinions. The government of 1984's Oceania controls its people's actions and speech in some ways that are obvious. Their every move and word is watched and heard. And the threat of what happens to those who step out of line is always looming overhead. Other forms of control are not so obvious. The population is inundated with a constant barrage of propaganda, made up of historical facts and statistics manufactured in the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Peace is the military. Labor camps are called joy camps. Political prisoners are detained and tortured in the Ministry of Love. This deliberate irony is an example of doublespeak, when words are used not to convey meaning, but to undermine it, corrupting the very ideas they refer to. The regime's control of language goes even further, eliminating words from the English language to create the official dialect of Newspeak, a crudely limited collection of acronyms and simple concrete nouns, lacking any words complex enough to encourage nuanced or critical thought. This has an effect on the psyche Orwell calls doublethink, a hypnotic state of cognitive dissonance in which one is compelled to disregard their own perception in place of the officially dictated version of events, leaving the individual completely dependent on the state's definition of reality itself. The result is a world in which even the privacy of one's own thought process is violated, where one may be found guilty of thought crime by talking in their sleep. And keeping a diary or having a love affair equals a subversive act of rebellion. This might sound like something that can only happen in totalitarian regimes. But Orwell was warning us about the potential for this occurring even in democratic societies. And this is why authoritarian alone does not Orwellian make. In his essay Politics and the English Language, he described techniques like using pretentious words to project authority, or making atrocities sound acceptable by burying them in euphemisms and convoluted sentence structures. But even more mundane abuses of language can affect the way we think about things. The words you see and hear in everyday advertising have been crafted to appeal to you and affect your behavior, as have the sound bites and talking points of political campaigns, which rarely present the most nuanced perspective on the issues. And the way that we use ready-made phrases and responses, gleaned from media reports or copied from the internet, makes it easy to get away with not thinking too deeply or questioning your assumptions. So the next time you hear someone use the word Orwellian, pay close attention. If they're talking about the deceptive and manipulative use of language, they're on the right track. If they're talking about mass surveillance and intrusive government, they're describing something authoritarian, but not necessarily Orwellian. And if they use it as an all-purpose word for any ideas they dislike, it's possible their statements are more Orwellian than whatever it is they're criticizing. Words have the power to shape thought. Language is the currency of politics, forming the basis of society from the most common everyday interactions to the highest ideals. Orwell urged us to protect our language because ultimately our ability to think and communicate clearly is what stands between us and a world where war is peace and freedom is slavery.
So many people criticized Donald Trump for being Orwellian, for the way that he was manipulating language to create a new version of reality. And his war with the press is a part of that agenda, to create a new reality, a new narrative, a new vision. So, Orwellian in that sense means this idea of manipulating language to create a reality, and included in Orwell's story 1984, we see the presence, this relationship with government that's flawed because government is manipulating and controlling us. So in a course about freedom and control, in a course about the relationship between government and governed, many people turn to Orwell's 1984 on their essay to say, this is, typical essays are kind of like Goldilocks. This is what too much authority looks like, and they can use 1984. This is what too little authority looks like, and maybe they look at anarchy or chaos, and then they say this is what just right looks like. So one way to begin to plan an essay is to establish why the absolutes, the extremes are dystopian. And underneath that, it's natural to talk about 1984. So, although you won't be tested on the diploma on the multiple choice on 1984, it might leak into some of the sample multiple choice questions that I've given you there. But more so, I'm just asking you to think about using it on your essays. Now we also have a summary of the plot of 1984 here, and by looking at the summary, you wouldn't need to watch the movie, you wouldn't need to read the book. There's a movie too. So if you're like, well, I'd like to refer to 1984 as hypothetical evidence, but I've never read the book, and although that TED Talk gave me some of the themes of 1984, I don't know any of the characters, I don't know the plot. This will give you a list of that. This will tell you about Winston Smith and his relationship with Big Brother and how he ends up being caught and tortured, and how he ends up, well, I don't want to give away the whole story. So let's see 1984. Let's look at the summary of the story so that you can use it on an essay.
1984 is about totalitarianism. A totalitarian government is one that tries to control every aspect of life. How people spend every minute of their time, even in private, who they can associate with, what they're allowed to say. A totalitarian government even tries to control what people think and what they believe. George Orwell wrote 1984 in the late 1940s. What he knew about totalitarianism was based on the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Those governments had come into being not that long before, and they weren't very well understood yet. What Orwell was trying to do with 1984 was to give his readers a clear picture of what life would be like if a free country like England were under totalitarian rule. 1984 takes place in London. The London in the book is a depressing place. There's never enough to eat, the food's disgusting, there aren't enough clothes or shoes or anything to go around, and the city is pretty dilapidated.
So even there, from a citizen perspective, you could say that Orwell's London of 1984 is not ideal because it's not providing a quality life for the citizens. Because they live in economic poverty, because the finite resources of the state are being allocated towards mass projects that glorify the state at the expense of the standard of living of the citizens. So they're reallocating the resources instead of dealing with poverty and desperation of the citizens. They're saying, hey, let's make some cool pyramids.
Except for these giant pyramid-shaped government buildings that rise above the landscape. There's some sort of war going on, and no one really understands what it's about. Rockets frequently explode in the streets and blow people to bits. The worst part is that the government is always watching everything people do. There are these posters of Big Brother, who's supposedly the leader of the government, that say, Big Brother is watching you. There are thought police who have hidden cameras and microphones literally everywhere. The government can watch you in your home through your TV screen, and you're not allowed to turn your TV off, ever. There are a lot of things you're not allowed to do in this society, and if you do them, the police might take you away and throw you into a forced labor camp. You're not allowed to have close friends, you're not allowed to be in love, you can't date or have sex with someone you like. You're basically supposed to save all your emotional energy for the party being the government.
So what kind of relationship should we have with the government, with the state? Well, in Orwell's London of 1984, the government is supposed to be our primary relationship. The government is where we project all of our love. And we see in 1984 that creates a flawed life, a dystopian life for Winston Smith, because now he has no personal relationships. So when Adolf Hitler wants to become a god-like figure for his Germanic people, when Stalin wants to be a god to his people, when King Louis XVI wants to be a god, when King Louis XIV wants to be the Sun King, it creates a perverse relationship, because anything that is everything for you can now do anything to you. And it's very dangerous to give them that much power.
Then there are things you have to do. You have to watch the government programming on TV, most of its news, some of its exercises. You have to attend pep rallies, including this one called the 2 Minutes Hate. So it's hard to even have time to think your own thoughts, because they're constantly filling your head with propaganda. The main character of 1984 is Winston Smith. He's 39, he has a job in the government, and he lives this horrible, dreary existence without any friends or anyone in his life. At the beginning of the book, he starts writing a diary to talk about how much he hates life in his society, even though writing a diary is one of those things you'd be killed for doing if you were caught. The diary is his place for thinking about his society. It's a place where he tries to imagine if life could possibly be different from the way it is. There's no way for him to know if things were ever different before, because the government has changed all the records of the past and rewritten all the history books. At the beginning of the novel, there are two other people who matter to Winston, and he doesn't even know either of them. One of them is Julia. Julia is this attractive young woman who works in the same building as him. She's some kind of mechanic. Winston basically hates her. He hates her because she's pretty and he can't have her, but he also thinks she's the sort of person who would turn him into the thought police. So he's afraid of her, but also sort of fascinated. The other person he's interested in is this portly guy named O'Brien, who's a member of the inner party. That means he's a boss, much higher up than Winston. Winston should be afraid of this guy, but he gets the sense that O'Brien is intelligent, so he has this yearning to be friends with him. He thinks O'Brien would understand how he feels about life. The book takes a turn one day when Julia slips Winston a note that says, "I love you." This note completely rocks Winston's world. Of course he's interested. He can't wait to get in touch with her. But it's very hard for them to say 2 words to each other in private with all these spies and cameras everywhere. Finally, they do manage to get out to the country, and they start this mad love affair. The love affair makes them both very happy. It's dangerous because they could be killed or sent to labor camps if they get caught, but that makes it more exciting. At last, Winston has someone who understands him and who hates the party as much as he does. But Winston needs to go that extra step. He's rebelling against the party privately by having the secret affair. Now he wants to go to the next level and be an active rebel against the government. He gets his chance one day when O'Brien invites him to his apartment to look at something work-related. Winston takes a leap of faith and guesses that O'Brien must be part of the rebellion, because no one invites people over to their home. It just isn't done. So he and Julia go to O'Brien's house and confess that they want to be rebels. And O'Brien says, "Yes, I'm a rebel too." And we all read this book that explains why things are the way they are. Winston reads the book, and he's blown away by it. Unfortunately, right after he reads it, the thought police bust in and arrest him and Julia and carry them off to the Ministry of Love to torture them. So we learned that O'Brien wasn't a rebel after all. He just wanted to catch Winston. In the Ministry of Love, they torture Winston in all sorts of horrible ways. They break his bones and his teeth, they use electric shock, they starve him, and on and on. He tells them everything he knows, he confesses to everything they ask him, and he tells them everything he knows about Julia. After torturing him over and over, O'Brien finally tells Winston what it is that the government really wants. What they want is to have total power over the minds of people like Winston. They want people like Winston to say 2 + 2 = 5 and really believe it, not just say it to avoid a beating. For the government, it's purely an exercise in power. They're not trying to control his mind for some other purpose, they just want to exercise total power over people's minds. They finally do break Winston completely in this place called Room 101, where they do whatever it is you're most afraid of. They lock his face into a cage and threaten to let these rats eat their way through his face. He has a phobia of rats, so he loses it and says, "Do it to Julia, not me," which is a complete betrayal of what's most important to him. The government has taken his last shred of integrity. After he does that, they let him and Julia go. The thought police don't care about them anymore. The two of them meet on the outside, but they can't love each other anymore. Winston and Julia are basically broken people after they get out. Winston has changed to the point that he doesn't even want to think about anything that might be rebellious. He just sits in a cafe listening to the news and smiling. The last words of the novel are, "He loved Big Brother." So, one of the points the book makes is that a human being can be broken down completely until he'll believe whatever you tell him, even if it's that 2 + 2 = 5. At the same time, the book has a positive message, which is that it's really hard to get inside someone's head to that extent. The government has to go to incredible lengths to brainwash Winston successfully.
So perhaps in university you might do a study of 1984 in an English class, but for now, that gives you a summary of the plot that you could use as hypothetical evidence in an essay. So, skipping over Brave New World for now, it does connect with the contemporary issue, 1984 does, the clash between security and freedom. And in that clash, we have key individuals like Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden is that whistleblower, that informer, that informed the US public that the NSA was betraying their Fourth Amendment rights, the right to privacy. and that we were being watched, that we were living in a Big Brother-esque America. And Edward Snowden, living outside of America now, because the American government see him as a criminal, has provided us many quotes about the relationship between government and governed. This is one of those. Do we want to live in a society where we live totally naked in front of government and they are totally opaque to us? The government is supposed to be accountable to the people. So the government is supposed to be transparent to us. But instead, the government's opaque. We can't see into government. We can't see into the deep state. It's so deep. Can't hold something accountable if we can't see it. But they hold us accountable. They're violating our privacy through this surveillance state. And although that's not Orwellian, because Orwellian is meant to be a description of the language, it's definitely illiberal. And it's definitely familiar to the use of technology in 1984. So what I have here are some links that follow this idea. We're going to look at that, and then I'll stop recording this part of it, and I'll give you time to review your notes and check out some stuff in the textbook and have a mask break if needed. So this first link takes us to an article, How Mass Surveillance Harms Societies and Individuals, and What You Can Do About it. So it's going down that rabbit hole a little bit further and saying, now that we're living in a mass surveillance society, how might that harm us? How might it harm us at a macro level, and how might it harm us in a micro level? So it's taking that idea of from Edward Snowden and whistleblowers like him and saying, how is this going to alter our reality? So I'm not going to read the entire article to you because there's a link here for you. But it's suggesting that the surveillance state is going to allow the government to create a culture of fear. And in that culture of fear, we will crave security. So we'll surrender our natural liberty in a Hobbesian way, right? We'll say, here's my liberty, give me some security, I crave it so much. And I crave security because you've sold me on the narrative that I live in fear, that Al-Qaeda can blow me up at any time, that kind of fear, or that this pandemic's going to kill me, that kind of fear. You create something that is so large that I need government to save me from it. Government's brilliant at that, and this is a liberal government. Liberal, not Liberal Party of Canada, but liberal meaning democracy. This is liberal governments in Canada and the United States that are doing this. So imagine how powerful the Chinese government is at this. I have a future lesson on that. So they collect metadata so they can watch us and learn about us, and to some extent they can begin to engineer us. They can grow us in certain ways by providing the proper stimulus. So we're like plants, and they can move the light so that we grow in certain directions. So they can, through the technology that we become addicted to, like that cartoon showed us yesterday, they can begin to grow us in certain directions by providing us links to those things. What's popping up? Well, what are the ads that are popping up? What are the suggested people to follow and stuff like that? Government can use technology to engineer you. It is a violation of our charter rights and freedoms, but even within the charter it says that our rights can be reasonably limited. Maybe you remember that from Social 10 when we talked about human rights. So some would suggest that in this climate of fear, it's reasonable to limit us. So we just have a quick little article here that you might want to consider taking a peek at, to look at some of the consequences of living in a surveillance society, how it's changing our relationship between government and government. So evidence shows that even the possibility of being under surveillance, so even if you're not under surveillance, but the possibility that you are, changes the way that people think and act. Well, I might be being watched, so I better be good. causing them to avoid writing or talking about sensitive or controversial subjects, discussions that are necessary for the functioning of a free society, for the growth of a free society. Beyond this self-censorship, the mass monitoring of citizens' communications and movements achieves only one thing: the development of mutual mistrust between the individual and the state. And the state right now in Canada, they want to track us, right? They're using the pandemic to say we should be tracked so that they can tell us if we have come into contact with COVID-19. So there's apps for that, right? And Alberta is one of the last provinces that's saying, you know, maybe we don't want this. Because we have, in terms of the political spectrum, we have the party in Canada, provincially, that is most in favor of individual rights and freedoms, freedom from government, right? We have a right-wing party. We have the UCP, the United Conservative, well, yeah, they're called the UCP, yeah, United Conservative Party. So, just something to take a peek at, especially if you're going to be writing an essay about our relationship between government and government. I'll leave that one there. We also have, and I know it's a little blurry, but what US voters think on trust in government officials over surveillance issues. 30% of Americans trust them, 52% don't trust them. So when surveyed, most Americans are saying, yeah, you know what, I don't trust the government watching me. Belief that the NSA data will be used by other government officials to harass political opponents. They believe it's likely that the NSA will be used for a political agenda by one party against another. So it is interesting that in the United States there's this concern. And that concern is being shown here in this cartoon. Obviously it's an exaggeration, it's a satire. So we don't really live in a glass house, but it's a metaphor for how government can see us, that there is no transparency. And yet, like Snowden said, government is opaque to us, but we're transparent to them. It's a flawed relationship. What should be a relationship between government and governed? In a collective society, we must adhere to collective norms. But we live in an individualist society. We're meant to be free and private from government. I don't see a lot of freedom here. I don't see privacy. So the bigger issue, some might say, is tyranny. So we have some other things here. We have a link that is meant to give you a list of, this is why we need surveillance, this is why we don't need it. So just some easy thoughts, because we are being watched, the government is tracking us, and this is why it might be a good thing. You know, to avoid crime and to trace pandemics and things like that. You know, public health might be a concern, but these are reasons why we don't want it. Including in China, the government is using technology to specifically watch ethnic minorities. So because they have facial, and I can't pronounce the next word, recognition like cameras, they can watch Muslims within their society, and they can track them. Not dissimilar to what the German Nazis did with the German Jews. So maybe we should be concerned about that. So the bigger issue here isn't just surveillance, it's tyranny. It's not that we're losing just privacy, right? It's more than just the loss of privacy. It's the usurpation of our freedom has led to a tyrannical relationship that we are at the mercy of, in the States, the NSA, and in Canada, CSIS. So the government says, hey, let's take a look into your closet. Honestly, the government, as Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau once said, the government has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. Trudeau was opposed to this usurpation of freedom, Pierre Trudeau. But now we have governments that are trying to not only micromanage us, but they want to watch us. They want to watch us. And that's invasive. So, here's a little article that can take you, and these articles, I don't pick 35, 40-page articles. These are articles that will take you 2 minutes to kind of skim through, take a little peek, and just see what you think about it. I don't want me to tell you what I think. I want you to take a peek and just see what you think. There's this idea that freedom entails risk. I like that quote. Freedom entails risk. So if we have freedom, we're going to have risk. You give me the right to bear arms, I might murder someone. But as I've told people when I have things taken away from me in line at the airport, I don't need a knife to murder you. I can take my belt off and choke you. Guess what? You don't get on the plane after you say that. They're like, you know what? You get to go sit over there now. What? I'm just saying, like, why are you taking that little tiny knife away from me when you're letting me keep my belt? And look at the boots I got on. What can I do with these? Then you get a special time out. So the whole point is that with freedom, we have risk. If you give people the freedom to bear arms, if you give them the freedom to speak, they may say hateful things when they get to speak. They may use those weapons in criminal ways. With freedom, it entails risk. We have a nice little article from Huffington Post on that from 2017 that's saying, you know what, we're coming up on Independence Day, and America is built on the pillar of freedom, but with freedom, it entails risk. So these are those things when you have that Daniel Billick moment, you have 5 minutes and you're like, you know what, I have 5 minutes to do some social studies. What am I going to do? Go back and take a peek at one of these rabbit holes. It'll help you out on your essay writing for sure. Security versus civil liberties is a related note. Freedom entails risk. North Korea has suffered no terrorist attacks, but no one wants to live there. Western Europe and the United States have been struck repeatedly, but they remain the destinations of choice for all those fleeing oppression. What has the intro been about? Individualism against collectivism. It's all summarized right here, right? It's all summarized right here. The debate over liberty and security has always been difficult, but the communications revolution coupled with the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS have made it even more complicated. Wiretaps, warrants were fairly straightforward in the age of the rotary dial, but they have little value in that era. But now that we have mobile phones and satellite uplinks, now they can use our technology against us. They can use our technology, our addiction to technology, to change their relationship with us. So, last hypothetical case study, and then I'll stop it, is the one on Brave New World. I'm not going to watch the 11-minute video. I'll leave that for you to watch if you wish. But the main story of Brave New World is that you have this main character, Bernard, that is an alpha, and they have a society where children are not born, they're hatched, they're engineered by the state, and they're engineered to fulfill certain roles in society. So some people are born or grown to be leaders, and some people are grown to be manual workers. And they're also socially engineered early on in life. So if you don't want somebody to be a manual worker as a baby, you'll show them a picture of plants and you'll give them electric shocks. So then they'll have like some kind of negative reaction when they see plants later and they want to stay inside. Or if you want somebody to love books, or hate books, sorry. If you want somebody to hate books, you'll show them a book and you'll give them a little electric shock. So they use, in the book, what is being used is this behavioral psychology, right? To change and manipulate the growth of children. But they do it at a macro level. Everybody's being socially engineered. And they use drugs. They use Sonoma to keep the people drugged. And much like 1984, you're not really meant to have personal relationships. But unlike 1984, instead of having no personal relationships, they basically just have sex with everybody. Like it's a mass, they have these orgies where they do drugs, have orgies, and the whole point is that the state wants you to do this because now you will have loyalty to the state and not really loyalty to any one person above the state because you have relationships with so many people. So it becomes, it's not just like the state wants you to do this, you have to participate in these parties. And it's meant to be a dystopia. You know, from a blurred distance, you look at you look at Brave New World and you're like, man, they got flying cars and stuff, that's cool. Or like, they seem fairly happy and wealthy because you're only looking at the alphas. But then when you break it down and you realize, well, then they can't have natural children, they're not meant to have personal relationships, then you're like, there is something lost here, and that's why it's a dystopia. So, that'll be the end of hypothetical case studies. And there's a link a little bit more to what dystopias are if you haven't seen that term in English language arts. But I'm going to end it there before it crashes. And then after that, we'll continue with a little bit more contemporary stuff and wrap up related issue 1.